Good morning. This meeting of the Conflicts of Interest Board is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Officers Law, Sections 100 et sec. For purposes of this meeting, I shall designate Julia Lee as recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of the following proposed amendments. There are 5 altogether, or a set of 5. Board Rules 1-07, Board Rules 1-101H, Board Rules 101E, F, and G, Board Rules 1-18, and Board Rules 1-13. So why don't we turn first to Board Rules 107, which deals with post-employment. This is the 3rd time we are hearing this. We are considering this matter. These have this involves staff changes as a response to our last discussion of these proposed rules. The principal changes, I believe, were the incorporation of a list of the advisory opinions that the rules are codifying, as well as mentioning which ones they're not, and some other changes, particularly the material dealing with consulting agreements that don't meet all of the requirements of the proposed rule, but nonetheless, the conditions where a waiver might still be possible. I thought in general fine. I had a couple of, I caught a couple of typos, and I maybe have one somewhat substantive question connected to one of the typos, but maybe I'll just open to see if people have any general comments, and then we can page through.
No, just the typo as well.
Okay. So I think I'm working off of Exhibit 4, which is the track changes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably the easiest to use. And they're the principal, sorry, just getting into place. On page 4, lines 10 and 11, it now reads whether unpaid or unpaid.
Right.
So presumably that's meant to be corrected. That connects up with a substantive question. Presumably there's a straightforward answer, I'm just not getting it. Which is if you jump to page 14, the post-employment appearances on 4, it just refers to compensated communication. So presumably there are some uncompensated things that are covered, but I didn't see any in the rule itself. In other words, if we're talking about paid or unpaid for post-employment appearances, on page 14, I guess it's line 4, the definition of post-employment appearances, the purposes, the restrictions on appearances by a former public servant before his or former city agency. Such prohibited appearances include compensated communications. What about uncompensated?
So the compensated or uncompensated issue is related to the, not related to the post-employment appearance ban, but rather related to the lifetime particular matter ban. Okay. So to the extent that that section of the rule only speaks to compensated communications, it's because that's the only section, that's the section of the rule to which that sort of, compensated communications are only section that matter there. The lifetime particular matter ban, it's always and forever.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to double check. I had one other typo, and I'm having trouble tracking it down right now. But so maybe I'll just turn back to the rest of the board and see if anybody else has any questions or comments. Maybe I'll have it in the wrong exhibit, but anybody else have any thoughts on this? Oh, sorry, I just about found my typo. Mm-hmm. It's on page 17 of Exhibit 4, line 12. I think the first in should be a no, where it says the former public servant played in-roll in.
Yes.
So the first incident. That's all I have, both in terms of substance and typos. I turn it over to the rest of the group for questions, comments, anything.
No, I just had that one typo, so.
Yep. Me too. That's all I had, that one typo.
Nothing for me. Oh, that one typo.
Okay,
yeah, that
so
one.
All right, we got that typo. We got it nailed. We got, okay, so hearing no further comments from the board or staff on the proposed amendments to Board Rules 1-07, I now call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendment to Board Rules 1-07 as the final rule. Do I have a motion?
So moved?
I have a second?
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 That sounds like everybody. Anybody opposed? Hearing none. The motion for the adoption of the proposed amendments as presented as the final rule has passed. Great. That's first one. Let's move on to the second one. Second one is the 1-10H, and Chad, you're still on the hot seat. This is gifts of travel. We saw this in December and January, then went to a public hearing in March. There were three comments, three proposals submitted by reInvent Albany. The staff laid them out for us. Chad laid them out for us very nicely, as well as reasons why not to do them. I'm persuaded, but I do have one suggestion or question, maybe thought, something to put out there, which is whether or not we should address any of these and our reasons for not going forward with them in the statement of basis and purpose, particularly the third one about frequent flyer miles, which seems closer. I mean, I agree that the first two, that the second one seems to just misunderstand the rule. And the first one seems to be so fundamental as to challenge the whole thing, and I don't know that it's worth addressing. But the one about frequent flyer miles is actually pretty close to stuff that we do in terms of vouchers. We could ignore it, or we could add something to the statement of basis and purpose to explain why, although we are requiring public servants to turn in their vouchers, we are not regulating frequent flyer miles. Any thoughts on that, either Chad or anybody else? I should start maybe with the board. Chad, as to whether or not that I'm disagreeing with the decision not to incorporate, but whether we might want to address it in the statement of basis and purpose. Carolyn, what do you think? I mean, you've had the most experience with these.
Well, my thought is that the frequent flyer mile rule that the board is in, the step we're proposing to incorporate is the rule that's been in effect for like 14 years. Mm-hmm. So to like, it feels strange to say we've been doing it and there's been no problems for this whole long stretch of time. So we're just being consistent. There's nothing, the board is not doing anything different than it has this whole time.
And so it's really the question about the distinction between the frequent files, I guess, and the vouchers, which I think was in the reInvent Albany comment.
Right. I think the thinking that the board had at the time in 2006 and the difference of the vouchers is the ease of transferability was part of the board's thinking. We could, if the board wanted, we could add an additional phrase or explanation for that distinction in the rule. I mean, then the statement of
I see no interest in changing the rule.
Right.
Just putting it out there. I'm not pushing it very hard, but I just, maybe because literally it's reflected something, a case I just taught in one of my courses involving a federal administrative law about how the statement of basis and purpose for proposed new rules ought to respond to, cogent, so there's some phrase about the questions of cogent materiality, and I was just wondering whether anyone thought this was worthy of attending to in the statement of basis and purpose. Any further thoughts?
Just as a practical matter, our practice in sort of in drafting these statements has been to have the statement of basis and purpose reflect only sort of the rule that's being enacted, and to the extent that the board's consideration of the proposal is reflected in the memo, that memo is still a public document.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. That's helpful.
That will be posted on the website. It'll be available for sort of understanding the board's reasoning and moving forward, but the statement as drafted only addresses the rule as adopted.
Okay. Actually, any further reactions to my comment or anything else? I realize I didn't mean to cut off any substantive discussion, although of the content of the rule before we decide whether or not it ought to be truly final. I guess this really would be truly final since we're now post-public hearing, right?
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Questions, comments? Okay. I think
this may be a naive question, but talking about travel-related expenses, it applies not only to gifts of travel from entities that are doing business with the city, correct? I mean, we've said on a number of occasions, public officials who take gifts of travel, for example, could be police commissioner and others, could be violating, I guess it's B3. And does this may be naive, but does this apply across the board? So what if you have a non-prominent city official who accepts a gift of travel from somebody who is not doing business with the city? Is that covered by these rules?
Yes, yes. The rule is uniform in its application to all public servants. And actually, the most common situation that we see is not extremely high-level people accepting gifts of travel. Much more common situation we see is more run-of-the-mill public servants accepting gifts of travel, usually related to professional conferences and other sorts of events. The most common situation we see is usually housing-related, and it's what we might describe as like mid-level housing officials going to housing-related conferences around the country. So it does apply to both firms that do business with the city and those that do not. It's both a B3 and a B5 rule, and it applies to everybody.
So that if there is a city official who accepts a gift of travel from somebody, having nothing to do with his or her job, from someone who does no business with the city, is that prohibited? So that anybody cannot accept a gift. I guess I assume if it's from an ordinary gift from a friend or family member that you would get, but you might get a gift in some other context entirely, having nothing to do with your city employee.
So this is a rule for public servants who are taking gifts of travel as part of their job. So that's why the agency head has to sign off on it. So any public servant, myself included, could take travel related to my job here. For example, COIB employees attend to the Conference on Government Ethics Law, COGL. I could accept a firm or another not-for-profit to pay for my travel to that conference with the agency head's approval. A gift that I receive of travel-related expenses that's unrelated to my job, that's not being approved by my agency head, would, if it violated some provision, if it was from a firm that did business with the city and it exceeded $50, which as travel it would be a violation of B5. And if it was from a firm that I dealt with in my city job, it would be a violation of B3. This is only for work-related travel. So this does not address personal travel or travel separated from my city job.
That's clear.
So, yeah, Jeff, let me just to make sure we're answering your specific question. I think if I understand correctly, you're just, the last part of what Chad said is the most operative bit. It's that 2604B5 prohibits any public servant from accepting any gift of value to $50 or more from any person or firm who does business with the city. It's a very broad prohibition. And the board has interpreted 2604B3, the misuse of position regulation, to prohibit public servants from accepting gifts that are being offered to them because of their city positions.
Right.
So there are all of these exceptions in the gift rule all operate, are all available options. They're all tools for accepting gifts. This specific one is just for gifts of travel in order to perform city functions. There are these other exceptions, including the kind of exception you were saying. So there is an exception for gifts from family members or close personal friends, and there's a set of criteria for knowing when those gifts are acceptable. That would also be operative. So if you got, if my grandmother offered me free tickets to come visit her, and she happened to work for a firm that did business with the city, the exception for family members would likely apply, and you wouldn't have to, the travel wouldn't have to be city work related.
But if we're from somebody not doing business with the city, it would violate B3 if there were certain we would find that one were using his or her position to get that to get that travel, or you were getting it because of your position.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Further questions or comments from the board or staff on the draft of the proposed amendments to 101-H? 101-01 paren H, excuse me. Okay, hearing none, I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendment to Board Rule 101H as the final rule.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion for adoption of the proposed amendment as presented as the final rule has passed. Great. All right, let's now move on to the proposed amendments to Board Rules 101 E, F, and G, which deal with gifts of meals and free attendance at conferences and events. This is the first time the board is seeing these, so maybe Chad could tell us a little bit more about this, and then we can go into the general discussion. So Chad, do you want to open this up?
Before we do that, do you think perhaps we should lay this one over? Because there are things in here that are substantial in terms of attendance at events and the like, that as I read it, reverse positions that the board has taken in the past. Maybe this should be laid over to allow the new members of the board to familiarize themselves with this and take it up for the first time then. I think it might be useful now because we'd have to repeat that, and I think the discussion that we have today will not bring it forward in that respect. That people may have a very pronounced ideas on some of the things that are contained in this in this rule, and it may be we've not considered it before. We've had it laying around since January. There are not going to be too many conferences and events in the next little while, and perhaps we ought to wait until there's the new full board could take this up anew, rather than begin the discussions now. Just a suggestion.
Well, why don't I ask Anthony and Fernando to comment on that, since it's going to be most directly relevant to the two of you. Would you benefit from a conversation now, or should we just put this over?
I actually had a different view on it, because I know the process that we've adopted is that we would review it, and if we had any legal questions, we would get to staff in advance of the meeting. For a lot of reasons, I haven't had time to dig into it and go into the staff with the questions I had. There were various AOs that I wanted to review, and I just didn't have the time to reach out to staff with my legal questions. So for that reason, I think that I might be in favor of postponing it so that I could get my questions to the staff and consistent with the prior procedure we adopted.
I'm fine accommodating the request to hold it over, but I recognize that other board members have prepared for this as well, but I recognize what Fernando's been through as well. So
Yeah.
I totally relate to that. We've all had that in recent days. But it's fine to hold it over, in my view, as well.
Okay, well, it sounds to me like we've had both the motion and the second on that. So to continue discussion in a future meeting, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion for continuation discussion at a future meeting has passed. All right, let's go on to A4, which deals with endorsements. This was before the board in February. At this point, this would be if the board moves this forward, it would then move on to the law department and the mayor's office of operations for to move into final form, and then we go to a public hearing. Questions, comments? This is just to make it clear to the public. This is proposed rule 1-18. Any questions or comments from the board or staff on the proposed amendments to board rule 1-18?
I have a comment on the bullets that were added, the descriptive examples. It's on page, let's see.
You've got it on
3,
Page-
Exhibit 2.
Yes.
I at the bottom of 3, it goes on to 4. It's my thought was that these descriptions of the confidential advice seemed a bit too specific. I guess I feel like the point of the confidential advice is to keep things somewhat anonymous. And if I were at all familiar with, you know, any of these people or these issues, I feel like I would know who they were, easily be able to find out. And I wonder if there's a way to be a little more generic in the types of things that are, you know, that are appropriate and that are not, without getting into the level of specificity that's here.
I mean, I see what you're saying. So maybe for the second one, the one about public transportation, it just should say promoting a city facility rather than public transportation. That would make it more generic. And then again, promoting tourism and the city facility with the elected officials district, and maybe instead of the next one, instead of advertising for a hospital, for a city facility, something like that. Would that, do you think that would help?
I think it would.
Okay.
Erica, I just, to respond to that comment, I'd sort of say 2 things. One, in a level of generality, I don't know that it was written originally more generally, and in my view, it didn't, to the extent that the board was seeking something descriptive to enable people to understand what a demonstrable nexus was. Once we go to the kind of generality that Richard suggests, you know, sort of drafted on the fly, it doesn't tell people what they might need to know to understand what demonstrable nexus means. That was the first concern. And the second, I would say, is that all the confidential advice that the board provides in writing arguably would have needed to be in advisory opinions. That's sort of the thing, and anonymized in a way. And if you look at the board's advisory opinions, historically, they would have this level of detail. It's sort of, I think, the public transportation and hospital are generic enough.
You don't think that city public service or city public facility would do the job?
The problem is that it's not a city public facility. The hospital was a private hospital.
A public facility in the city?
Well, the significance is, I think what was hard about the hospital thing is because the hospital is both a private institution and a public good, and having been on staff when the board struggled with that, that was the argument the elected official was making about what the significance of being in the advertisement was. So I feel like the word hospital sort of conveys a thing. We could take out the demonstrable these 2 bullet points, because I don't know, like I'm not sure what a reader would understand about an advertisement for a public facility. Like, why would the board have said no to that?
Erica, I get what you're saying. I think this is, I mean, if you look at the AOs that are cited there, I mean, they're going back decades. I mean, this could be anyone, even in the human services area. It could be a council member, a borough president, a mayor. I mean, I think it's so generalized, and it could be so remote in time as to not really indicate who it was.
The timing is actually a good point. Look, I don't have a horse in this race. I think it's fine. I just
It was a smart comment.
The comment, though, in confidential advice to me, and then look at you, wine time.
Iced coffee.
It's just the comment in confidential advice, then followed by that level of detail, to me just gives a little bit of an impression that really it's not so confidential. But to your point, Anthony, the timing, the remote timing, I think does alleviate the possibility of remote timing, alleviate some of my concern there.
I have what may be a silly comment, but for the very title of the rule, when I see the word endorsements, I think of political endorsements, and that's not what this is. And I'm wondering, just to clarify the title of the rule, it might be endorsements of products, or what is it, products, what was the phrase actually, products or programs, something like that. Although I notice it also says entities, and at some point that gets kind of long. But did anybody have that reaction when they saw endorsements? My first thought was that it meant political endorsements. I know it's not, the rule is very clear, but I'm really only literally talking about the caption of the rule.
Richard, in the rule is described in the notice of public hearing as the use of city title and promotional materials. How would you feel about that as the title of the rule?
I would love it.
Okay.
Great, that's a change we can easily make.
Any further questions or comments?
If there is a
maybe-
nexus between another city's purposes, it may be you're endorsing something that is important to the city. There's a nexus to a city program, but it may not be your agency itself. Somebody working for the homeless agency may want to endorse something relating to housing. It may be a nexus to the work of your agency or city.
Well, that's what it says. It says mission of the public servants agency.
Agency, but maybe the mission, it's not particularly the mission of your agency, but the mission of another city agency with which you may be involved, or which you may have something positive to say.
I think to that point, Jeff, I think the mission of many city agencies are to work together with each other. And so to the extent that one agency is involved in another agency's program as a partner or as a, as having some relationship with that agency's mission, certainly the example that you bring up, the Department of Homeless Services, certainly has an interest in housing more broadly, and so to the extent that that's folded within a city agency's mission, that would be appropriate. I would also note that this is only for non-city products. And so if so that any city agency can endorse any other city agency's programs, and that doesn't implicate Chapter 68.
We'll see how it plays out, but yeah, I understand the point.
Any further questions or comments? Okay, then I call for a motion that the board adopted the recommended amendment to Board Rule 1-18 with the very minor change of the change in the caption of 1-18 as the final rule. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the motion for adoption of the proposed amendment with that extremely minor change as presented as the final rule has passed. And now let us turn to consideration of the proposed amendments to Board Rules 1-13, and including also, I guess, the attached accomplice liability new material 1-17, which I guess we do together. This is our second go around with this. It's back from the Law Department in the Mayor's office. We go on to a public hearing with some of the minor changes that have been flagged for us in the memo. I don't see if anybody has any questions or comments on this one. I have one, and it goes to Exhibit 2. I guess it would be, sorry, I'm having trouble finding it. But I guess Exhibit 3, I said both of them. Exhibit 3 at the very bottom of page 4. The very last word on page 4, which refers to the use of city personnel. Does that mean the public servant, him or herself, or the public servant's subordinates? And if so, can you use your subordinates? Must that be voluntary on the subordinate's part? Can you compel a subordinate to do this kind of work? I was a little unclear what personnel meant. I wasn't sure it was limited to the individual, him or herself, or whether it involved using other people and whether it involved compelling other people or just working with volunteers.
Richard, where are you on the red line again?
I'm on the red line, the last word of Exhibit 3, page 4.
Exhibit 3, page.
No. C1. It's in C1.
Right, a public servant may perform volunteer services on behalf of a not-for-profit entity during times when such public servant is required to perform work for the city and may use city personnel. Can you, is that your subordinates? Can you make them do it? Or is it just voluntary collaborative work?
Your subordinates.
And you can make them do it.
Yes, so that's true of the existing rule as well.
Okay.
And it could be asking for volunteers of public.
No, well, volunteers, I'm less concerned about.
But
It's
it would
more
be
about whether or not you could compel somebody to work on not-for-profit work if it's consistent with with the guidelines for your own work.
Yes, and this would be. I guess I would add to Ethan's comment that this requires the agency head to approve that activity, and so by doing so, that folds that into the agency's work in some way that would permit a superior to be able to compel their subordinate to perform that work. So it's all under the supervision of the agency head, and
So it becomes part of the official city job.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well,
For the subordinate, it would.
yes.
Yeah, it's in pursuit of a city purpose, and therefore the person may need city resources to help pursue that city purpose, and so the city resources they normally would rely on are also available as a result of that.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure I understood it properly.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Any further questions or comments on the proposed amendments to 113 or proposed new 117? Okay, hearing none, I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended to board rule 113 and the new proposed new board rule 117. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? No? Okay, the motion for adoption of the proposed amendment to 113 and the addition of new 117 is passed. I believe this draws to a close the open meeting portion of today's meeting. So I hereby call the open meeting portion of our meeting to a close.